Hello, America. Welcome. It is Eric Erickson here across the United States. I am delighted to have you with me. The phone number is 877-973-7425. As always, text Eric, E-R-I-C-K, to 33777, and you can be on the program. Well, so I had a really good series of meetings on Friday and Saturday with some Republicans, super secret meeting of the vast right-wing conspiracy. I was flying home yesterday, and I looked at Philip and I said, I honestly, I don't even have to do a lot of show prep for tomorrow. I already know what I'm going to talk about out of the gate because it's happening again. In 2020, when the George Floyd protests became a summer season of riots, the American media, particularly at CNN, this is where it happened. I think it was Ali Velshi at the time, who's a progressive from Al Jazeera and MSNBC and the like. He described the protest, I think it was him, described the protests as fiery but mostly peaceful. Fiery, but mostly peaceful. Well, there's a problem. Polling has come out. And the polling shows that something like 49% of Americans are opposed to what's happening. 49% of Americans are opposed to what's happening with the protests. Only 20% support. Only 20% support. It's a pretty big deal. That is a pretty big deal. 49% oppose, only 20% support. And in fact, if you were to force the people who are completely undecided how they stand, a majority of them say they think they're opposed. This is turning bad for Joe Biden. Columbia University has now canceled its graduation. Imagine that you work your butt off for college. You work your butt off. You're looking forward to graduation, and the hecklers get the veto. That's what's happened at Columbia. It's given Donald Trump some fodder.
Now, it just came out, Columbia just canceled their commencement, Axios. Columbia just canceled their commencement. That shouldn't happen. And it also came out that the protesters, many of the protesters, are backed by Biden's donors. Okay? Are you listening, Israel? I hope you're listening, Israel. Hope you're getting smart. But they're backed by Biden donors. That's where the money's coming from. And I'm not surprised at all.
So, yeah, look, he's telling the truth. It is Biden donors have funded these protests. And isn't it remarkable that the word comes that Biden, his donors have funded the protesters who've turned violent on these college campuses. And now suddenly is, well, they're mostly peaceful. And in fact, in 2020, what happened was some outside group produced a report that said 95% of the protests have been peaceful. And the media ate it up and ran the headline, 95% according to an independent, nonpartisan research study. And now it's 99%, probably from the same left-wing research group saying the same thing. Over at MSNBC, they have picked this mantle up to make sure everyone knows these are mostly peaceful.
Jeet, I'll start with you and your reading of these mostly peaceful protests and how they have been covered by our media and how they have been described by pundits in the media. Why does the focus seem to be on the spectacle rather than the actual substance of what is behind these protests?
Well, I think the two things go together that you brought up, which is the actual violence in Gaza, and I would add the West Bank, and the hysteria about the protest. That the same media that wants to ignore what is happening, the mass slaughter of civilians, also wants to denigrate and lie about the protesters. And it's really remarkable. I'll add beyond peaceful. Like if you actually talk to the protesters and engage with the movement and go to some protests, as I have up here in Canada, it's an incredibly inspiring movement. It is one of the most multicultural movements that has ever existed in the United States. You see people of like all shades and colors from all around the world, united by their outrage at what is happening in Gaza.
United in their outrage. Did you catch that? Did you catch that? If you go to one of these protests, like I did in Canada, he hasn't even been to these college campus protests. But don't you get that? The fringe, they're on the outside. We heard a professor on CNN last week say the fringe, they're not actually spewing anti-Semitic stuff inside the Columbia Square there in the tent village. They're not seeing yet. Don't believe your lying eyes. Yes, there was. It was remarkable. So the spin is on from the left that you actually, you can't believe your eyes, that these are mostly peaceful. It's outsiders and troublemakers. Ro Khanna, one of the most progressive members of Congress.
I mean, you can't be shouting guillotine, guillotine. You can't be shouting globalize the intifada or Zionists don't deserve to live. What's being lost is that those few protesters who are inciting violence or engaging in that kind of anti-Semitism are diminishing the thousands of young people who simply want the war to end. And I guess I would say look to John Lewis or Dr. King. They, in their protests, were above reproach. If some individual engaged in bigotry, they call them out first and loudly. So I'm proud of a lot of the young people who want to end the war. But they need to show the discipline. And some universities have. Look at Cornell. Look at University of Minnesota. Look at what's happening at Northwestern. There have been efforts not to have the police in, to have dialogue with the student protesters, to have much more peace and calm. And there are models for what can work in this country.
There are models. Even get away from the anti-Semitism, please. Get away from there. The Democrats using the Sunday shows to try to push the protesters in the direction to go. Ron Brownstein was on CNN talking about some of the political implications of this for Biden and the crack up within the Democratic Party that the protests are causing.
So far, which is to say that protest is, perfectly American. It's sort of in our DNA, but there are excesses, and it can't veer into violence. It should not veer into anti-Semitism. It certainly should not veer into anti-Americanism. He's trying to hold what Arthur Schlesinger once called the vital center on this issue. And as I said, I actually think on the issue of protest itself, he is probably in a pretty safe position politically. The problem is affirming that position is just kind of salt in the wound for those younger voters who are alienated on him about the war. Ultimately, I think his policy toward the war is the real issue here. And the question of whether he can repair the breaches in the Democratic coalition over that, I think, is in the long run going to be more important than kind of finding a relatively defensible centrist position on the protest itself.
A relatively centrist position on the protest itself, less important to do that. Now, why? Why is all this happening? One more piece of audio for you. David Brooks was on PBS over the weekend. David Brooks of the New York Times, they're one of their centrist voices. Listen to this.
President running against the protest. It's not so much the message of the protest, it's the violence that surrounds them. I'm teaching at the University of Chicago this term, and a couple hundred yards from here, the encampment at our school is there. And the university had a very clear policy. We celebrate your right to express your point of view, but we don't allow you to make the campus violent. We're not going to let you disrupt campus. We're not going to allow you to disrupt learning. And today, the president, Paul Losavatos, sent out an email to everybody in the community saying, we celebrate the right to make your statements. Unfortunately, the students have been disruptive. They've torn down Israeli signs. They've silenced speakers. They've made the campus. They've interfered with learning in the campus. And so he sent out a somewhat ominous email. And I have to say, things are pretty tame here compared to a lot of the other places. So what Americans support is free speech. What they don't support is what looks like anarchy. And so I think if the protests continue to veer in the direction they're veering, you could see some pretty serious repercussions, which is why Biden is speaking, which is why Chuck Schumer is speaking, trying to distance himself from what the protesters are doing.
Serious repercussions. That would be Donald Trump getting reelected. Notice the point that David Brooks makes at the beginning. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan both got elected as the middle class responded to left-wing protests gone awry and reacted by moving to the right. That's why we're suddenly seeing all of this concern about the protests and all of this spin that don't believe your eyes, don't believe your eyes, everything is fine, everything is fine. Everything is not fine when this is happening. Everything is not fine on the Democratic side when suddenly it looks like Donald Trump has something else to run on. And by the way, Republicans are starting ads on this. I had a couple people text me over the last few days, said, where are the Republican ads on this? They're coming. I've seen some of them, including in Las Vegas. There are some ads that are going to be out there tying the Democrats to this. In fact, one of the things Joe Biden has done that, if you recall, the Democrats turned on the GOP in 2020 is when Donald Trump and others said all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter. The Democrats scream, but it's not everybody under attack right now. It's not everybody under assault right now. It's only black people. And so you've got to say Black Lives Matter. And there were people who were coming out and saying, hey, look, I get the sentiment, but yeah, this is what's going on right now. And this is why people are saying Black Lives Matter. And what is Joe Biden doing right now? Saying, I condemn the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia because all lives matter. Clearly revealing that it was Democratic opportunism in 2020 to yell at people saying all lives matter. A reactionary response by the right saying all lives matter provoked a counter-reactionary response from the left and the media about, well, that's not what's going on right now. But notice the media is not out there telling the Democrats right now, hey, Islamophobia isn't the issue right now. The issue is these campus protesters screaming death to the Jews. And the public has seen enough of it. The public has seen so much. Public opinion has turned decisively against the protests. And so now the Democrats are in damage control. So I need to paint the broader picture for you here. That's the most important part of this. For months now, because this isn't new. This is only like we've entered the summer riot season for the left. But since October 8th, the day after the Hamas attack, you started seeing anti-Semitism rear its head on college campuses. For all the lecturing about the right and the tiki torch whites and the racism and the white nationalism and the anti-Semitism of the right, October 8th was a defining moment. You had people coming out cheering Hamas on college campuses. You had Jews at the school in New York that were locked in the library. You had students at MIT and Columbia and Harvard, Jewish students who were harassed in their dorms and on campus. You've had screams about globalize the Intifada, which is a call for attacks on Jews. You've had cheers of Palestine will be free from river to sea, another genocidal call against Jews. You've had all of that since October 8th. But these college campus protests have turned violent in the last couple of weeks, and the polling has shifted dramatically. Since the protesters got violent, the polling shifted, and only now that the polling shifted are Democrats upset about these nasty anti-Semites on campus. Your lesson is very simple. Democrats are perfectly fine being a party full of anti-Semites until it affects their polling. Again, like with Joe Biden being forced to finally come out and condemn anti-Semitism, and even then he both sided it with also Islamophobia, Democrats refuse to do the right thing until polling tells them they must. Welcome back. It is Eric Erickson here across the nation. The phone number is 877-973-7425. Should you wish to be on the program, delighted to have you with me. As always, you can text Eric, E-R-I-C-K, to 33777. Get the show notes, the podcast, the live stream, all that sort of stuff. I want to go back to this point because this really does need to be emphasized again, just to remind you how political it was. In 2020, when Democrats insisted everyone bend their knee and chant the dogmatic phrase, Black Lives Matter, many people on the right responded with actually all lives matter. And between the Ahmaud Arbery situation and the George Floyd situation and several other situations, Democrats were like, no, It's what's at stake right now is not everybody. What's at stake right now is what's happening to black Americans, and you need to say Black Lives Matter. The right reactionary response of All Lives Matter was met with a justification that what's happening right now isn't about everybody. It's about black Americans. I actually pointed out at the time that, yeah, they're actually right on that, given the time and the sensitivities at the time. But the problem, however, is that if you're going to put the black square on social media, it's absolutely meaningless if you're just doing it to virtue signal. And there was a lot of virtue signaling. So now you fast forward after October 7th of 2023. 1,400 so Israeli citizens murdered per capita. It's worse than 9/11 when you take into account the 350 million Americans versus the number of Israelis. Its percentage of population death toll was higher. 200 people, including a number of American citizens, taken hostage by Hamas. And what do the Democrats do? They all lives matter it. Joe Biden says when he condemns anti-Semitism, he first also, I also condemn the people who don't know what's going on in Palestinian areas. What the hell does that mean? And then he's like, I condemn anti-Semitism and I also condemn Islamophobia. In fact, when the president finally addressed the nation on the issue, he spit as many words, and that's by design, I'm sure, as many words condemning discrimination against Arab Americans and Islamophobia as he did condemning anti-Semitism. He all lives mattered it. No one is being hostile to Arabs in this country right now, but there are a whole lot of anti-Semites calling for death to the Jews. And the Democrats who lectured us on all lives mattering not being what was needed at the time are now insisting that we have to condemn Islamophobia with anti-Semitism. Fascinating to watch that work, is it not? The real pickle that these people have found themselves in through their emotion and illogic. Y'all, I got to tell you about Old Glory Bank. Old Glory Bank is my bank. And so I did something with Old Glory Bank. I came back from Vegas. I had a good chunk of cash with me coming back. I did well at the craps table. And unlike the old online bank that I used where you couldn't take cash with Old Glory Bank, I was able to go to a local retailer, scan a QR code, give them all my cash, and it's already been credited into my bank account. You can't do that with an online bank. You can with Old Glory Bank. That's how innovative they are. You, my friends, can go to oldglorybank.com today and sign up for an account. oldglorybank.com. It is my bank. It's FDIC insured. It's equal housing lender. Terms and conditions apply. They're so innovative. It's a completely online bank account, and I was able to deposit cash to Old Glory Bank. That's how great they are. oldglorybank.com. Go get your account from Old Glory Bank today. Hello there. It is Eric Erickson here. The phone number 877-973-7425. There is some interesting news out. This is from the New York Post. MIT has tossed its diversity statement hiring requirement, becoming the first U.S. university to throw it away. They've also gone back to insisting that their students take standardized tests in order to enroll, which is intriguing. MIT will know this from the New York Post. MIT will no longer require prospective hires to pledge allegiance to the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion as an employment condition, becoming the first elite university in the country to do away with the controversial practice denounced by free speech activists as a political litmus test. Requests for a statement on diversity will no longer be part of applications for any faculty positions at MIT, a university spokesperson told the Post. The decision was made by Sally Cumbleth, the president of MIT, along with support of the provost, chancellor, and all 6 academic deans. My goals are to tap into the full scope of human talent to bring the very best to MIT and to ensure that they thrive. Once here, we can build an inclusive environment in many ways, but compelled statements impinge on freedom of expression, and they don't work. That's good to see. There is a backlash coming. You know, at MIT, they had a world-renowned cancer researcher who appeared on the verge of cracking the code on what causes cancer, and he was accused of sexual issues on campus. They fired him, and like a year later, an investigative outlet, I want to say it was the New Yorker, New York Times, or somebody, but basically found that the allegations weren't exactly legit, and the guy is still radioactive, on the verge of making a serious breakthrough in cancer, and just nobody wants to hire him right now after what happened up there. It's diversity has run amok. Now, speaking of diversity, Donald Trump, he's out looking for his VP candidates. I want to begin here with Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem has just beclowned herself as she's gone on television dealing with the book that's coming out. I believe it debuts this week. She's added more substance to the story of the dog, putting it in more of a spotlight. This is her conversation with Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation.
And I just wonder why you concluded that a young dog was untrainable and not just take it to a shelter.
This dog was a working dog, and it had come from a family that already had issues with this dog. And I had put months and months of training into this dog. This dog had gone to other trainers as well. So all of that is the facts of the story, and all of that shows that when you put someone in a position where they have to make a decision and they want to protect their family and protect children and other people from getting attacked from an animal that has attacked others and killed livestock, that's the choice I made over 20 years ago. And that I didn't ask somebody else to take that responsibility for me, that I had to make that decision myself.
Okay. Had she said that in the book, would have added more context. Came from another family that couldn't train it. It seemed to be untrainable, thought I could do it, tried to train it, couldn't train it, and we had to put it down. Farm life. Would have been a way different story from what she actually put in the book. Now, her answer to this is that it was the ghostwriter. But there's a key point to be made here. Kristi Noem's doing the audio version of her book. I've done the audio version of my book. You do the audio version before the book comes out. And so you've read the whole book. So she read the passage the way it was written at the time from her ghostwriter and didn't have any complaints. She only now wants to clarify it because of the outrage over how it was covered in the book. But wait, there's more, because she also mentioned in the book that she had met with the leader of North Korea. Didn't go well either.
So you write about lessons learned in leadership, and you bring up some specific incidents I want to ask you about. You talk about meeting some world leaders, and one specific one, quote, "I remember when I met with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, I'm sure he underestimated me, having no clue about my experience staring down little tyrants. I've been a children's pastor after all." Did you meet Kim Jong-un?
Well, as soon as this was brought to my attention, I certainly made some changes and looked at this passage. And I've met with many, many world leaders. I've traveled around the world. As soon as it was brought to my attention, we went forward and have made some edits. So I'm glad that this book is being released in a couple of days, and that those edits will be in place, and that people will have the updated version.
So you did not meet with Kim Jong-un. That's what you're saying.
I've met with many, many world leaders. I've traveled around the world. I think I've talked extensively in this book about my time serving in Congress, my time as governor, before governor, some of the travels that I've had. I'm not going to talk about my specific meetings with world leaders. I'm just not going to do that.
But you wrote about it in your book. And now you can't even just, but if you listen, of course, the careful advocate of Kristi Noem will say, well, she said, no, I'm not going to talk about. Oh, so she said no. No, she didn't meet with him. Good Lord. Again, she did the audio version of the book. So she encountered all of this stuff already and is only now having to pivot when it's become public and people have questioned this. She's pretty much destroyed her chances to become the vice presidential nominee for Donald Trump. I mean, that is a brutal rollout for her book. It's not just her, though. I mean, we got the parade of characters coming out now. You know who else is in the vetting? This guy.
Former presidential candidate and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, who was at Mar-a-Lago this weekend and is on everyone's short list for the president's vice president, to be vice president or running mate, joins us now. Governor, your reaction to the ways in which the Democrats are handling these protests on these campuses. They're all over the place.
Well, they are, and I think it's just a great contrast between President Trump, who's leading with strength, and Joe Biden, who's his weakness. I mean, we talk about the campus protests, but these protests wouldn't be happening if Joe Biden hadn't invited these wars that are happening all over the world because of his weakness.
So you got Doug Burgum out there. You got Kristi Noem out there. They're not alone. You've also got this guy out there, Tim Scott.
No, ma'am, it did not come up. African-American unemployment rate is 6.4 today.
But what about being VP? What about being President Trump's VP? Did it come up at all? Do you think you're on his short list?
I hope that the president will choose a person who helps the country unite and heal. I certainly expect to have a decision from President Trump in the next 60 days or so, but he did not bring it up. I certainly didn't bring it up. I'm excited that in this nation, a poor kid from South Carolina could rise to the level of being a United States Senator. It just tells me that all things are possible for kids growing up in poverty today. Listen to this show and know that all things are possible for your future.
One more. Also making the Sunday show rounds, this guy.
I think Joe Biden, or he hasn't done it again because he's weak and he's feeble. But Joe Biden, very early on, should have said, as I asked him to do back in October, if you're in the streets of the United States, you're here as a visitor on a visa. Okay, you're not an American. You're here on a visa, and you're here to teach, or you're here to go to school, and you're out there chanting on behalf of Hamas and Hezbollah and these terrorist groups, who, by the way, also hate America. We should revoke your visa. If you are here in this country as a visitor on a visa, and you are defacing statues of George Washington, ripping down American flags, putting up Palestinian flags, you should have your visa revoked. And
that's Marco Rubio. Now, Trump was caught in a recording at a private luncheon. Someone recorded his phone call or recorded his luncheon and leaked the audio to Axios, where he mentions all the people he's looking at. Here's what he says of Rubio, quote, his name is coming up a lot for vice president. That suggests to me Rubio's not it, because when you listen to his remarks about all the others, he finds them very flattering, but he doesn't really say that about Marco Rubio. About Tim Scott, he says, quote, as a candidate, he did a good job, but as a surrogate, he's unbelievable. Of Kristi Noem, he says, somebody that I love. She's been with me, a supporter of mine, and I've been a supporter of hers for a long time. And then there's the one that stood out in my mind. He notes Tim Scott as a surrogate, which is the role of vice president. He's unbelievable. And then you got Doug Burgum, quote, I didn't know this. He was a supporter of my two campaigns. And then there's the next sentence. He's a very rich man. Trump does want the money to fund his campaign. So I would put Burgum and Scott at the top of the list for VP prospects. But there's J.D. Vance, who is on the list. And I don't know that Vance is up there, but this is what he says. He wasn't a supporter of mine at the very beginning. He was saying things like the guy's a total disaster. Anyways, I got to know him a good bit. As a non-politician, he's become one of the great senators. That doesn't sound like a VP. Between Doug Burgum, he's a very rich man, and Tim Scott, as a surrogate, he's unbelievable. I would put those two at the top of the list. Now, nobody knows. Tim Scott says we will know within the next 60 days. He's led to believe. We'll find out. I do have to say, I am not advising Donald Trump. Donald Trump does not talk to me about this sort of stuff. I would tell you, if I were to give him my advice, Tim Scott, he's right. He's an unbelievable surrogate for Donald Trump. He's an unbelievable surrogate for this country. I am biased. I genuinely like Tim Scott. I think that he's the happy warrior that the public wants right now. I think being a black man who has been successful in this country as a descendant of slaves would make him the fantastic person to go up against Kamala Harris. who is the daughter of immigrants. Tim Scott, Kamala Harris, she likes to lecture this country on its flaws. She's the daughter of immigrants who became a success in this country. Tim Scott is the great-grandson of slaves in this country, whose family, unlike Kamala Harris's family, was in slavery in this country and yet loves this country, unlike Kamala Harris. I think it would be one hell of a dichotomy to put the two of them on stage together, and Tim Scott genuinely loves people. Unlike Kamala Harris, he has a gregariousness that Kamala Harris does not have, and I think that matters on the campaign trail. And I think adding Tim Scott to the list, I'm biased. I like Tim Scott. I realize it. But I think of this long list of people that he has mentioned, and I didn't get into some of them. So Rubio, Scott, Vance, Mike Lee of Utah, Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, Doug Burgum, Kristi Noem, Elise Stefanik of New York. She's out, I'm told. Byron Donalds of Florida, Wesley Hunt of Texas, Michael Waltz of Florida. The House members I don't think are on the list. I think it's governors and senators on the list from what I've been led to believe. And again, I could be wrong, but Scott makes a ton of sense. I think Scott would be a great vice presidential pick, and Donald Trump is on the money. Tim Scott is a fantastic surrogate who makes people who don't like Trump like Scott enough to vote for Trump, and that calculus is going to matter in a very close race. Prosperity is possible in this country. It's something that Tim Scott knows, and Americans for Prosperity wants to remind you prosperity is possible. They're doing a bus tour around the country called Prosperity is Possible, and they just want to remind you that we already know how to turn this country around, how to get it economically revitalized, how to deal with inflation. We've done it before. Republicans have done it. Ronald Reagan did it. George Bush was able to do this. Donald Trump was able to do this. You can go to prosperityispossible.com and you can find out where the bus tour is going to be in your community. You can take your friends and family and you just hear from great speakers who remind you we don't need something new. We don't need some sort of flashy Democratic proposal here. We just know from the right, as a conservative, what matters in this country. And what matters is prosperity, and it's possible. Free markets and free people is what Americans for Prosperity supports and advocates for. It's why they're doing this tour. Go to prosperityispossible.com today. Find out where it's going to be in your neighborhood. Americans for Prosperity is a do tank. They get into the states and they do the business of the conservative movement. And they want to remind you, we don't need fancy newfangled policies out of Washington. We just need them to do the tried and the true that work. And you can find out what those are by going to a local tour of Prosperity is Possible. Go to prosperityispossible.com. Find out the nearest location near you. This hour of the program brought to you by First Liberty Building and Loan. They are in Noonan, Georgia, but whether you are in Greenville, South Carolina, or Sacramento, California, doesn't matter. They can help your business. If you're buying a building or you're building a building or you are buying a franchise or expanding a franchise, that's the sort of stuff First Liberty handles. And they make their own lending decisions, and they have helped businesses become big businesses since the 1990s. You can reach out to them at firstlibertyga.com, firstlibertyga.com. You can get all their contact info. Tell them I sent you. Spend 10 minutes with them. See if you're a fit for them and them for you. The worst that's going to happen is they say no or you decide no, but they really love to help businesses, and they're experts at it. firstlibertyga.com. I got to play for y'all some audio here. This is pretty unbelievable. Don Lemon, I guess he's doing some sort of online show now, and he had on Taylor Lawrence. She is the spectacularly unaccomplished writer who was at the New York Times and moved to the Washington Post. She covers online stuff. She is a hyper leftist. She tries to elevate leftism. She wasn't very accomplished, and I think got her job because of connection somehow or another. She's just not. She's also one of those people who can't believe that people are not wearing masks anymore in the country. She's hyper scared to death of COVID and the left and everything else. And so she has this conversation. Listen to this. Don Lemon calls her out on this.
Well, then, Taylor, how do you reconcile the way marginalized groups, many of the people in these marginalized groups, obviously they are fighting for Palestine, right, for the Palestinians and for what's happening in Gaza. But yet in Gaza, they would not have any freedom. They don't
have freedoms in Texas and Florida. Does that mean?
But they don't. But I understand that. But Taylor, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. If I go to Texas, they're not going to throw me off of a roof. They're not going.
Yes, thank you, Don. Yeah, she's, they don't have any freedom in Texas or Florida. Really? They can vote. They can run for office. The former mayor of Houston is a lesbian. You've got gay members of Congress from those states. She really believes they don't have any freedoms. That's how a leftist, and she's a reporter at the Washington Post, which is a Hamas mouthpiece at this point. It's remarkable that her first reaction to Don Lemon when trying to, how do you reconcile these groups in this country, underprivileged groups, non-white groups, how can they support Hamas given they wouldn't have any freedom if they were guys? Well, they don't have freedom in Texas or Florida either. Really? Go look at the number of gay members of legislatures in Florida and Texas and the gay communities in Texas and Florida and ask them how they're still alive. Absolutely absurd. She's on the payroll of a major news publication in this country. A major news publication. And that was her reaction. It is a genuinely absurd stance, and yet this is what we get from the left. It's all emotions driven. She doesn't like the people of Texas and the legislature in Texas, so she presumes that, of course, they're natural allies to Gaza. Kudos to Don Lemon again. I have plenty of criticisms of Don, but he's willing to point out in Texas and Florida, if you're gay, you're not going to get thrown from a rooftop. It's just insanity that this is where the left has gone. In fact, they've gone so far now down this path. The Biden administration has announced, well, they haven't announced, they've just done it, and people found out about it, and it got leaked by Israeli officials. The Biden administration has decided to hold ammunition back from Israel because the Israelis have decided they are going to go into Rafah and take out Hamas. So the Biden administration, really to placate liberals in this country, progressives in this country, has decided to stop giving weapons to Israel to defend itself. And yes, there's a lot of bipartisan outrage about it.